Hello, everybody. Hi, everybody. I'm going to take a few minutes to share. Hi, Gina Marie. Hi, Dolores. Nice to see you both. Okay, be with you in just a minute now. Just a few more shares. Hello. How are you tonight? Hope everyone is well. Hi, Jeffrey Denton and Wade Bickel. Bickel, I'm not sure how you pronounce it. Very nice to see you, though. Thanks for coming. Wow, somebody's been sharing a lot for me. I suspect that's you, Dolores, so thank you very much. I think we're missing a few people who are normally here. Kay's joined now. Hi, Kay. Nice to see you. Hi, Dale. Nice to see you. I'll wait for a few more of our regulars. I hope everybody's okay. It was a little hot here in the Washington area today. I suspect that's true all across the eastern seaboard. Very, very hot. Unfortunately, Bonnie and I had to go shopping today, and we're feeling the effects of shopping in the heat. Hey, Russ, great to see you. How you doing? Was it hot in Hotlanta today? Well, I'm going to pick up where I left off yesterday. So I'm going to start sharing some posts and try to talk about them as briefly as possible. I wanted to catch up a bit with Dave Dayen and what he's been saying. So let me share a bit how we're doing on the economy based on the jobs report of last week. It's really last Thursday. Anyway, Dave talked about it on July 2nd. The jobs report showed 4.8 million jobs were gained, and many in retail. At the same time, though, there were 1.4 million new unemployment claims. But the monthly report showed 4.8 million jobs gained, an unemployment rate down to 11.1%. Leisure and hospitality led the way with 1.5 million jobs, about 40% of the total. And retail added another 740,000. Even government jobs went up slightly. This is likely due to a complicated seasonal adjustment error. When I said 1.4 million new jobless claims, I meant first-time jobless claims. And continuing claims increased slightly. Dave says over 31.1 million Americans are taking jobless benefits right now, either regular benefits or the special pandemic unemployment assistance for gig workers and freelancers. The difference is clear. The June jobs report references a moment when state governors were allowing restaurants and bars and retail shops to reopen. And the first time jobless report references last week as governors in many states put a pause on that process. I think Dave's exactly right when he refers to that. I think he's exactly right. I mean, that's what happened. The June report is really biased towards the first couple of weeks of the month when everybody was opening up. But the 1.4 million new jobless claims happened but towards the end of the month. And that showed people starting to get really cautious about the process because, as we know from last night's stream, the reproduction rate of COVID-19 is now over 1.0 in 40 of the states of the United States and is under 1.0 in only 10 of the states. So while 2 weeks ago, Virginia, for example, was under 1.0, somewhere in the low 90s, now it is slightly over 1.0 at 1.02, which means the number of cases in Virginia is growing again. The number of cases in 40 states in the United States is now growing again. Dave says this only worsened this week. It shows the difficulty of using a monthly barometer like the jobs report to supply information during a fast-moving pandemic, which can rebound and change the economy much more quickly than a month at a time. In the face of this, our wonderful Democrats in the Senate just unveiled a plan to tie expanded unemployment to the monthly jobless rate. Dave says that seems wrong for this particular crisis, ? Ask the question. That seems wrong for this particular crisis? The bill from Senators Ron Wyden and Chuck Schumer would start phasing out the $600 a week boost when unemployment in a particular state falls below 11%. The state numbers come later in the month, but if the national rate is tentatively at 11.1%, many states are likely below that. And if you only get a monthly snapshot, you're not going to catch up to increases in cases coming from lockdowns. You could have a worker's unemployment check drop for a month at the precise moment when it's more difficult to get a job. If we had a vibrant public job sector, maybe this would be fine, but we don't. In other words, if we had the job guarantee, the federal job guarantee, maybe this would be fine, but we don't. In fairness, the Wyden-Schumer calculation is based on a rolling 3-month average, which will smooth out the kinks a little bit, and the decrease is only $100 a week for each percentage point until it fully phases out once unemployment hits 6%. The 3-month lag, of course, could mean that good months linger in the calculation when the state of things has radically changed, and an individual seeking work is disconnected to everyone around her seeking work, yet her unemployment benefits will rely on the level of unemployed, which is a little odd. I think that was the understatement of the year. It's very odd. The proposal also maintains gig freelancer benefits until next March and extends benefit weeks, both with triggers tied to the state unemployment rate. The biggest impediment to automatic stabilizers like this has been the Congressional Budget Office. So good for Wyden and Schumer for not waiting for or worrying about a score. And in general, I prefer automatic stabilizers too, but they're inevitably tied to a lagging indicator when the virus moves quickly. In the current environment, with unemployment replacing so much lost income, it might create a yo-yo effect with lowered benefits leading to tighter consumer spending, leading to higher job loss, leading to higher benefits. Not a good spiraling effect. That is a yo-yo effect. Automatic stabilizers that rescue people in moments of crisis happen to have solid support across the country with 79% support, according to a Groundwork, a collaborative poll. And 3/4 of voters want expanded benefits to continue right now, but Senate Republicans want expanded benefits to die. And the outdated June jobs report will give them ammunition, even though we haven't even climbed more than 1/3 of the way out of the hole created by the pandemic job loss. The duration of the gains will create a narrative of success that will spur the Republicans to cut off benefits. And the narrative is that expanded benefits are a disincentive to work, which doesn't at all square with 7 million people going back to work in May and June. But after all, it's the Republicans, so why should we expect any logic? I added that, of course, Dave didn't say that. Ultimately, the virus, not the level of unemployment benefits, is dictating the state of the job market. We need a policy response to fit those particular circumstances. Maybe the policy response should be tied state by state to the R rate. the R rate each day. Why not that have be the indicator that triggers things? So Dave also reports that with the virus itself, case counts reached 50,000 in the U.S. on Wednesday, and death counts remained at 697, which was lower than a week ago. He then tries to get into it, tries to explain why the deaths have been going down. So he went to the COVID tracking site and pulled out the data for 15 states with the most intense rises in cases right now to see if the national aggregate was hiding any state spikes in deaths. Of those 15 states, only 3, Arizona, Texas, and South Carolina, showed anything close to an increase in deaths. In the other 12, deaths are sloping down despite cases rising for a month. For South Carolina, the increase is barely visible. Arizona and Texas do seem to be having more trouble, though in Arizona that's driven by 2 outlier days, one yesterday with a lot of deaths, and in Texas, really by yesterday's total. Otherwise, you'd see a plateau. Meanwhile, case rises and even hospitalizations all happened a month ago. If hospitals can't handle patients in these states, more deaths will occur by default, which is why it's imperative to get a handle on cases. And the real death toll is just obviously higher than the official number. At best, we're looking at trends. Everyone is bracing for the worst, which is appropriate, but it's really the case that treatment has improved after 6 months of dealing with the disease, that the medical interventions are happening earlier with better testing, that older people are being more wary of infection. Yeah, we certainly are. We stay home whenever possible. And higher caseloads are seen in the young. This pandemic is bad news if only 100 people die per day, and we're far from that. But I just wouldn't expect the kinds of numbers in terms of fatalities we saw in April. So let's move on to one of Dave's columns about what's happening with the vaccine. And here he tells us, let me share that. Da, 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 da. He did this one on July 3rd. There's a nice photo of a test subject receiving a shot of the phase 1 Moderna vaccine trial in March. They're one of the 3 drug manufacturers leading the way at getting a coronavirus vaccine approved. So Dave's wife has threatened to stop reading his unsanitized column if he consistently makes her angry and depressed. So this one was done just before the holiday on the 4th. It was done on the 3rd. So in this truncated holiday edition, he says, let's focus on something positive, or at least potentially positive, a vaccine for coronavirus. He says we're about 50,000 new cases a day away from suppressing the spread in the U.S., so a vaccine sounds pretty good. He says it's salvation, really. He says the good news is that there are 17 vaccines currently in human trials around the world. A pretty remarkable achievement in such a short time span. It's not hyperbole to say this is the largest science project in global history, and it's moving slightly ahead of schedule. The end of the year seems more plausible. The Oxford AstraZeneca project is testing 3 of these vaccines, and 1 has progressed to a stage 3 trial out of 4. This means it's been tested on humans against a control. It's been monitored for adverse side effects, extended to a larger universe of humans, and passed all checks and tests. The phase 3 trial also surveys for toxicity and adverse effects, but on a wider scale. Okay, the progression to phase 3 makes this a leading candidate to come up with a vaccine the fastest. The news leading stock boards this week, however, had nothing to do with the Oxford AstraZeneca study, but a successful phase 1 study touted by Pfizer and BioNTech. The 45-person study registered a high antibody response and also fever. That's actually somewhat normal, as it shows stimulation of the immune system, but the study is back at phase 1. So a long way to go to hit approval. Thousands of test subjects later, no older patients were included in the study, which seems like a problem. So the Moderna project, one of two in phase 2, has also been heavily hyped. Like AstraZeneca, the Moderna vaccine uses the messenger RNA, and a peer-reviewed study is expected as soon as this month. Phase 3 is also due soon, though it's being delayed slightly. The initial schedule had it starting this week. Moderna has not produced any medicine in its 9-year history, but its shares are up over 200% on the year on the expectation of winning the vaccine race. These are largely government-paid studies. The U.S. government has vowed to fund all 3 phase 3 trials for these companies. While the research is socialized, investors won't bet on success without the expectation of big private profits. Bloomberg and other business news sites are treating this like the Super Bowl of stock speculation. As each study, like Pfizer's, is released, not only does their stock rise, but rival stocks plummet. Why exactly is that the case? The global benefit to a vaccine is in trillions and literally in every human being on the planet's interest. Why is it automatically assumed that a corporate-backed arms race, quote unquote, provides the best way to reach a resolution most quickly, especially when the public sector is already fronting most of the money? Indeed, there is no, quote, private competition, unquote, driving the development. Really, just government dollars. There should be lots and lots of information sharing going on with these studies. We have the best communications infrastructure in global history, and scientists can collaborate as never before. This shouldn't be a race. The questions really all come after the vaccine is developed on manufacturing and logistics and also delivery to billions of people around the world. Given that we're worried again about having enough cloth masks for hospitals, this is a huge challenge. And he says, maybe business innovation could be put to use there, but why segregate scientific development that's already in the public domain? Why indeed? Makes no sense at all. No sense at all, folks. No sense at all. Maybe business innovation could be put to use there, but why segregate scientific development that's already in the public domain? There, I said it again. There's also the little matter of how the taxpayer is paid for the research once and therefore shouldn't be needed to pay for the product again. Some of the trial data has been made public, which is very good, so experts can tear it apart and learn from it. The entire thing, in fact, should be a shared, crowdsourced, collective action. Secrecy makes as little sense as the bidding up of stocks based on which firm gets to the finish line fastest. We're going to have a vaccine, and the faster the better. Let's do it so the most people benefit. Who was it who was telling us the other day we ought to forget about a vaccine because we're not going to have a vaccine? Dave disagrees. He thinks we are. He thinks we're going to get there. But notice he's not saying this year. He's not saying this year. So let's stop sharing here. And let's move on to an interesting analysis about the CARES Act. Okay, let me share that for you. I'm sure you'll find this interesting because it speaks to incompetence in passing legislation. Dave wrote this on July 6th. There's a little photo of a bar in Texas called the Ice House, established in 1928. Actually, it says West Alabama Ice House. It's closed again. Bars in Texas have closed down, a scenario set in motion by federal crisis response. And Dave points out, we returned from a holiday weekend to continued uncontrolled outbreaks in the South and Southwest. Yeah, this was from today. I just wanted to double check that for you. Returned from a holiday weekend to continue uncontrolled breaks in the South and Southwest and tentative steps toward shutting down that which was reopened. Texas, Michigan, and Arizona closed bars. California locked up dine-in seating in restaurants, and larger chains are rethinking reopening plans as well. The closures don't even have to be official. States that opened early and saw cases rise have seen reversals at restaurants and other business activity as people suddenly don't want to put themselves in danger for the meatloaf special for some reason. I thought that was good. Most of the leaders in these states won't commit to new lockdowns, and you won't catch them admitting error on opening too soon. But it's important to understand the dynamics underlying the second half of the first wave and why we failed where so many other developed countries succeeded. It goes back to the CARES Act. The legislation, as you recall, paid people for staying at home during the lockdowns, which was an important step at that time. The goal was to use the unemployment system to keep people safe, alive, and afloat while the country tried to manage the outbreak. Well, that would have been good, of course, except, as you know, the unemployment system didn't work for a few weeks. And for many people, even more than that, and people could not get their relief for that time. Dave says the PPP also paid businesses to keep people on payroll, but unemployment was the more dominant mechanism here. It was. What the CARES Act did not do was protect cities and states who were about to lose giant chunks of tax revenue as a result of this plan. Not only were millions of people coming off of payrolls, after all, states withhold, right? And when people spend money, they collect money in sales taxes, but their income taxes are withheld, right? States didn't get those contributions because people were coming off of payrolls. Many states do tax unemployment, but some, like California and New Jersey, do not. But reduced economic activity was crushing sales tax revenue as well as use taxes like road tolls. States were staring at hundreds of billions in shortfalls, and unlike the federal government, they could not borrow their way out of trouble or keep their budgets unbalanced. The federal government did not borrow its way out of trouble, as Dave very well knows. What the federal government did was to print its way out of trouble. The borrowing was only incidental, because that's what we do. We pretend that the borrowing is creating the revenue that we spend, but that's not what really happens, as all of you know. Anyway, that's beside the point here. The CARES Act supplied $150 billion to states, but only for emergency coronavirus spending, not accounted for in state and local budgets. So it could not be used to plug increasing budget holes. The continued shortfall was closer to $1 trillion, and it grew every minute that cities and states remained locked down. This weighed heavily on cities and states and unquestionably played a role in the timing of the reopening. While most developed countries waited until their average case counts were quite low before letting people back into the world, states were pressured into salvaging their economies and bringing in some semblance of revenue by throwing open the doors. This was a direct result of not having any guarantee from the outset that state and local budgets would be taken care of. The result has been catastrophic, and the states that opened early know it. It's hard to disassociate the budgetary desperation with the ideological impulse in conservative areas to back the president by trying to roar back with the economy. Greg Abbott and Ron DeSantis would have probably reopened, that is in Texas and Georgia, even if they had billions in reserves to weather the lockdown. But look at my home county of Los Angeles, no home to Republican lickspittles, which clearly reached a breaking point where it felt the need to generate more revenues by getting retail and restaurant spaces open. Now, of course, they're having to close again, right? There's no doubt that the official reopening orders gave many residents confidence to venture back out when they should have stayed home, leading to wider outbreaks. Yes, I had one of those experiences. Bonnie and I went out 2 Sundays ago to our favorite place here, and had a pizza in their outdoor area. We weren't even in the indoor area, okay? And I came down with a virus from the experience. Now, I was tested. It was negative for COVID, and it didn't at all behave like COVID. It behaved like a stomach virus with lots of diarrhea. And you may remember I was feeling slightly under the weather for days, but that happened because I suppose, it was reopening. The R statistic was lower, and so I went out and I immediately got a virus. Okay. It was a lucky thing I had insurance. I didn't have to pay for the COVID test. It was free. And I didn't have to pay to talk to my doctor on video. That was free. And I got care, okay, and everything was all right. But I think we were stupid to venture back out. We should have stayed home. And we've been very cautious about the whole time. But now we're going to be even more cautious. Because, we're in the critical age group. There's no doubt about that. There's no doubt that these businesses in these cities and states are now in far worse position economically than if they waited it out. Restaurants that managed to survive. But by the way, I should add here, do any of you remember how back, must have been in February, I'm not sure exactly when it was, in late January, early February, okay, I covered, an article that basically predicted, or at least went through the worst scenario we could possibly follow with respect to COVID, which was the scenario of not testing and contact tracing and quarantining, and instead waiting for community spread and then getting the community spread and shutting down the communities and then reopening too soon and having another community outbreak because we reopened too soon, and possibly then going into a number of these alternating things where we reopened too soon, being driven by economic pressures because Congress did not act in the proper way. Well, that's exactly what's happening in the United States. That's what we're doing. So restaurants that managed to survive in March and April only to open and face a downturn in July are much less likely to persevere. In other words, they're much more likely to go out of business. Just in the immediate term, food purchased in the expectation of reopening will not get used, meaning it will probably spoil. In fact, I suspect that maybe what happened to give me the stomach virus was that this restaurant that we often go to may have purchased some food in an expectation of reopening earlier, or may have stored food while it was closed in the expectation that the food would still be good, and maybe it had started to spoil. Maybe that's what caused the problem. I don't know. Anyway, food purchased in the expectation of reopening will not get used. Workers brought back will be sent home. The start and stop was economically and emotionally jarring, and it risks a wider failure. It also has put all other businesses at greater risk by increasing the amount of virus. Yes, the viral load, the viral spread. It makes it hard to send people back to offices or other less perilous activities. This hurts local economies even further, and this damage was precipitated by depriving them of a safety net in the initial bill. This association between the lack of state fiscal aid, the premature reopenings, and sustained epidemics isn't particularly novel. Eric Levitz of New York Magazine made substantially the same case last week, but he pulled his punch, blaming the issue on Republicans. The CARES Act bill passed 96-0 in the Senate and virtually unanimously in the House. Democrats worked hard and took credit for the main economic survival pieces, the ones that created the incentive structure to reopen early. You cannot wedge this into a partisan framework. I think I can to some degree. Specifically, the Democrats knew the Republicans controlled the Senate. The Republicans made it perfectly clear they were not going to bail out state and local governments. Why did they make it perfectly clear? Because on ideological grounds, Mitch McConnell and his Republicans hate government. They'll bail out business any day in the week, especially big business. But they won't bail out even the state and local governments that they control. They have the governorships in most of these state and local governments. They have the legislatures in most of these state and local governments. But they still hate government, even when it's state and local government they control. So they would not move to bail out these governments. The Democrats knew they would not move to bail out these governments. So Democrats fought for aid to individuals, but did not fight hard for aids to the state and local governments in the CARES Act, as they should have. As they should have. So I think the Democrats are partly to blame for not fighting, but on the other hand, they knew they couldn't win against the Republicans and Mitch McConnell in the House. So to some degree, they did what they could do. People needed money. They needed to make rent. They needed to survive. I don't think the Democrats fought sufficiently hard. These Democrats fold all the time anyway. I'll give Dave that. But at the same time, with the Republicans acting and talking the way they did, It's not surprising they didn't push the state and local aid at that particular time, but that they waited for the political pressure to build up. Dave says, and you certainly cannot turn around and call the CARES Act a solid crisis response when it ignored the central feature that set cases spiking out of control. The CARES Act was hastily assembled. He's dead right there. And didn't fit together logically. It created a scenario where cities and states would be ruined if they followed proper public health guidelines. And it subsequently set in motion the horrific and social economic outcome we're mired in today. It was certainly a congressional failure, but I think the failure was more on the side of the Republicans than on the side of the Democrats here, to be fair. This is crunch time, says Dave, for the next coronavirus bill. And maybe this time state and local aid will make it into the deal. Maybe by now the mayors and the state governors and the legislatures will lobby the freaking Republicans in the Senate. I know the Democrats will go for big state and local aid, at least $1 trillion, because that was in the HEROES Act, at least that, maybe more. But I think the lobbying pressure from the states and localities has to come from the Republicans who are predominantly controlling those localities right now. By waiting for months to ensure mayors and governors that they won't be left behind, Congress put them in an impossible position, induced them to open prematurely, and severely damaged the recovery. Not, quote, Republicans, unquote, Congress with the most bipartisan bill in recent memory. I didn't like the bipartisanship of it either. Okay, so now on to another area of performance, an entirely different area of performance. This time, this area of performance deals with civil rights and civil liberties. Okay. I mean, obviously, we're failing in the economy right now, right? It's failing. It's about to turn around again. In other words, we've seen the unemployment rate go down to 11.1%. We're about to see it shoot up again and go into basically the previous trend. So I'll be with you in a second for another spate of articles. Okay, let me start by sharing something that is well worth seeing. This is a Medium post by Lauren Martinchek. It was done on June 29th. And the article is entitled Americans, You Live in a Police State, subtitle, It's time to wake up and come to terms with this reality. And there's a picture of the police with their shields, their face shields and their body shields. And Lauren says, I haven't been able to stop thinking about Elijah McClain. I haven't been able to stop thinking about the fact that a 23-year-old, 140-pound a black man was unarmed who enjoyed playing the violin for shelter cats in his spare time. It was evidently such a threat to the police, who stopped him on his walk home. They needed to put him in a chokehold, have him injected by a medic with 500 milligrams of a horse tranquilizer, even after he'd been robbed of his consciousness, resulting in 2 heart attacks and his death. Like so many others before him, he pleaded for the state to let him breathe. Like so many others before him, we now know his last words as he begged for his life. As the cops were robbing his brain of oxygen, he cried, quote, I can't breathe. I have my ID right here. My name is Elijah McClain. That's my house. I was just going home. I'm an introvert. I'm just different. That's all. I'm so sorry. I have no gun. I don't do that stuff. I don't do any fighting. Why are you attacking me? I don't even kill flies. I don't eat meat, but I don't judge people. I don't judge people who eat meat. Forgive me. All I was trying to do was become better. I will do it. I will do anything, sacrifice my identity. I'll do it. You are all phenomenal. You are beautiful, and I love you. Try to forgive me. I'm a mood Gemini. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Ow, that really hurt. You are all very strong. Teamwork makes the dream work. Oh, I'm sorry. I wasn't trying to do that. I just can't breathe correctly, unquote. Before this incident occurred, he, quote, committed the crime, unquote, of wearing a ski mask, telling the officers he had the right to go where he was going, and allegedly say he was taking his power back when they agitated him. Evidently, in the eyes of the state, that was enough justification to rob him of his life. Just imagine if it had been a trained mental health professional who had been sent to approach him instead as a 4'11", 98-pound certified nursing assistant working in a nursing home for a measly $12.20 an hour. I can say with confidence that I do a better job of de-escalating a situation than a significant portion of cops across the country do, and I know I'm far from the only one. It's about time for us as Americans to acknowledge and accept the fact we live in a police state. How can we say otherwise when the New York Police Department, NYPD, has a fiscal budget of $5.6 billion, while at the same time Andrew Cuomo cut $8.2 billion in localities? How can we say otherwise when the Aurora PD rolled right through and broke up the violin vigil for Elijah McClain, the young man they murdered? One young man was so distressed due to the interaction he was having with them that he began to vomit before losing consciousness and apologized for doing so. Oh, I'm sorry, that was Elijah McClain. What else are we supposed to call it when Los Angeles school police were able to purchase armored vehicles and also grenade launchers? Even in the midst of all these near constant reminders of the brutality people continue to experience at the hands of the state, a significant number of the masses seem to be satisfied by some type of statues as opposed to taking meaningful action like a general strike. Meanwhile, the officers involved in the murder of Elijah McClain have been reassigned in an effort to protect them. And only one of the cops that shot 8 bullets into the sleeping Breonna Taylor has been fired. Still, no one has been charged with her murder. The largest civil rights movement in history began in recent weeks after the murder of George Floyd by Officer Derek Chauvin of the Minneapolis Police Department. I hope that Angie remains persistent until the police departments across the nation are dissolved and replaced with something that actually has the health, safety, and well-being of the communities in mind. After virtually every single flaw in our society has been laid bare in recent months by the current crisis, I hope we use this opportunity to demand better. That was hardcore for change. In what respect do we live in a police state? Well, there are many respects in which the police state is encroaching. But the area in which I think we see it most far advanced is the area of policing, of the actions of the police towards blacks, in individual policing situations, and as well in the actions of police towards protesters who are exercising their civil rights and their free speech, their freedom of speech, their freedom of assembly. These freedoms, of course, are guaranteed by the Constitution. They are routinely violated by police departments across the United States. This has been going on since the Seattle protests against the G7 in the late 20th century. Okay. And later, during the Occupy movement, it was notorious all over the country, the violations of civil rights, and civil liberties. We've seen it here frequently in Washington, D.C., in marches, in demonstrations. The arrest of people who have done nothing wrong, herding them into pens, and then failing to charge them with anything, and letting them go. I mean, that's wrong. It restricts their freedom of assembly and freedom of speech even when they're not charged. Sometimes they're held overnight without being charged. These things do damage to people when they have these rights. They are illegal actions carried out by the police all across the United States in vital areas of our constitutional rights. They killed Elijah McClain, but they also, this shouldn't be forgotten, they also violated Elijah McClain's constitutional rights to just walk home. Just walk home. Violating constitutional rights should be a crime. It should be a crime. Which brings me to the next thing I would like to share. And that is a piece I picked up in Truthout. Protesters attacked by police are suing to vindicate their constitutional rights. And boy, do I love to see that. Now that's a picture of police approaching protesters in New York City. Clubs at the ready. Clubs at the ready. Shields. Face shields. Near City Hall, June 1st, 2020. Sorry, July 1st, 2020. This article was written by Marjorie Cohn for Truthout, published on July 3rd, the day before Independence Day. It was a celebration of Independence Day, right? What is Independence Day a celebration of? It's a celebration of throwing off the yoke of a tyrant. It's a celebration of the rights of man. Protesters demonstrating against white supremacy and police brutality in the wake of George Floyd's public lynching have been met with illegal repression by law enforcement. Absolutely. Police have utilized toxic chemical and sonic weapons, dangerous projectiles, intrusive surveillance, physical violence, and kettling to trap demonstrators after dispersal orders are given. In a study conducted by University of Chicago Law School's International Human Rights Clinic, researchers found not one police department in the 20 largest U.S. cities, catch that, the 20 largest U.S. cities in compliance with minimum human rights standards governing the use of lethal force. They called the use of lethal force by police, quote, state-sanctioned violence, unquote. By the way, let's remember, this didn't happen in Venezuela. This didn't happen in Russia. This didn't happen in China. This violation of human rights. This didn't happen in their cities. This happened in the 20 largest U.S. cities without even one in compliance with minimum using human rights standards governing the use of lethal force. Victims of police abuse are filing litigation, and at least one judge has put a halt to some of the most egregious misconduct. Now, that is different from what happens in some other countries, but we haven't seen it go very far yet, so let's see what happens. On May 30th, Tina Krunko was marching at the Black Lives Matter Los Angeles rally when police shot her in the ribcage and biceps with kinetic impact projectiles, KIPs, also known, that is KIP, KIPs, also known as rubber bullets, quote unquote. KIPs can result in serious organ damage and even death, particularly when shot at the head, neck, or torso. Krinko is a plaintiff in a class action lawsuit filed in the U.S. District Court in the Central District of California by the National Lawyers Guild, Black Lives Matter Los Angeles, and the Los Angeles Community Action Network. Krinko was also hit on her forehead above the eye. She bled profusely and experienced temporary hearing loss and extreme pain. 3 weeks later, she's still suffering nerve damage. One other plaintiff in the Los Angeles lawsuit, Alicia Barrera Trujillo, participated in a peaceful protest on June 1st. When she tried to leave a little before 5 p.m., she and other protesters were kettled, quote unquote, surrounded by police to prevent anyone from leaving. Police then fired rubber bullets into the group. And Barrera Trujillo alleges that an officer sprayed an aerosol agent at a woman with a small child who was crying. Both the woman and child exhibited pain from the spray. Catherine Miller was on the ground kneeling in a June 1st protest when a Philadelphia police officer pepper sprayed her in the face and then pulled down the goggles on the woman next to her and sprayed her too. Quote, less lethal weapons such as tear gas and pepper spray grenades and impact projectiles such as sponge rounds, baton rounds, and rubber bullets should never be shot at close range or aimed at the head as serious injury or death is possible, according to Amnesty International. On May 31st, the Minneapolis Police and Minnesota National Guards shot projectiles at people standing peacefully on their front porches, a report by Amnesty International concluded. Before they started firing, the forces yelled, quote, light them up, unquote. They were apparently retaliating against people outside after curfew, using their smartphones to videotape the forces. The report documented 125 incidents of police violence against protesters in 40 states and Washington, D.C. from May 26th to June 5th, committed by state and local police departments. 125 incidents. National Guard troops and security personnel from federal agency. The abuses recorded in 500 videos includes beatings, misuse of pepper spray and tear gas, and inappropriate, even indiscriminate firing of rubber bullets and sponge grenades or sponge-tipped bullets. Quote, these human rights violations by U.S. police against peaceful protesters, which were neither proportionate nor necessary to achieve a legitimate law enforcement objective, are particularly egregious as they have occurred at demonstrations denouncing just such police behavior, unquote. That was noted by the Amnesty report. Even when a minority of protesters committed unlawful acts, quote, security forces have routinely used disproportionate and indiscriminate force against entire demonstrations without distinguishing, as legally required, between peaceful protesters and individuals committing unlawful acts, unquote, the report found. Okay, going on, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but there were violations of protesters' First, Fourth, and 14th Amendment rights. On June 5th, Judge Albrook Jackson, who's a U.S. District Court judge, issued a temporary restraining order enjoining the Denver Police Department from using, quote, chemical weapons or projectiles of any kind against persons engaging in peaceful protests or demonstrations, unquote. Police cannot use kips to target the head, back, or pelvis, or shoot kips indiscriminately into a crowd. Chemical agents, irritants, including tear gas and pepper spray, can only be used after a dispersal order is given with adequate time for compliance, and officers must allow safe egress. That is no kettling. Judge Jackson found a strong likelihood that the Denver police violated the Fourth Amendment by using excessive force and the First Amendment right to free speech. But plaintiffs claim that police aimed at their heads and groins, which caused broken facial bones and ruptured testicles. The complaint also alleges that police used, quote, pepper spray, pepper balls, rubber bullets, flashbangs, and tear gas to punish plaintiffs for demonstrating against police brutality, unquote. I would say for demonstrating against previous police violations of constitutional rights. The judge found that, quote, irreparable harm, unquote, would result if the plaintiffs were not granted immediate relief because the protests are ongoing, and the use of excessive force would have a chilling effect on the plaintiffs' exercise of their freedom of speech. Quote, I recognize the importance of shielding and uplifting this ongoing nationwide movement. As such, I find that irreparable harm would occur were I to deny this relief, unquote, Judge Jackson wrote. And also said that property damage, quote, is a small price to pay for constitutional rights, especially the constitutional right of the public to speak against widespread injustice. He added, If a store's windows must be broken to prevent the protesters' facial bones from being broken or eye being permanently damaged, that is more than a fair trade. If a building must be graffitied to prevent the suppression of free speech, that is a fair trade. The threat to physical safety and free speech outweighs the threat to property. Thank God some judge somewhere said that. The first amended complaint in the Black Lives Matter Los Angeles lawsuit says that from May 29th to June 3rd, Los Angeles Police Department arrested approximately 3,000 people. The police chief admitted that well over 92% of the individuals arrested were engaged in peaceful protests. He admitted that there were wholesale violations of the constitutional rights of 92% of 3,000 people. I haven't figured out what that is exactly. It's over 2,700 people had their constitutional rights violated by the police. That should cost the Los Angeles Police Department $2 billion. Jesus. Plaintiffs allege that police misconduct resulted in the violation of the First, Fourth, and 14th Amendment rights. They charge the LAPD used, quote, indiscriminate and unreasonable force against thousands of protesters and used unreasonable and excessive force by hitting, quote, at least close to 1,000 protesters with batons and or rubber bullets, unquote. Plaintiffs attest to being restrained with tight handcuffs, denied bathroom access and access to food or water, and provided insufficient ventilation during transport, making them vulnerable to COVID-19. That's assault, folks. In my view, that's assault. And the officers who did that should be subject to lawsuits for assault and arrest for assault as well. They endangered the lives of those people. On June 1st, President Trump and Attorney General William Barr ordered the use of chemical weapons against peaceful protesters in Lafayette Square in Washington, D.C. to facilitate Trump's photo op holding a Bible in front of St. John's Episcopal Church. Police used tear gas, flashbang shells, smoke canisters, pepper balls, and rubber bullets to disperse the crowd. The ACLU, the District of Columbia, Washington Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Urban Affairs, and Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under law sued Trump and Barr on behalf of Black Lives Matter, D.C., and other protesters. They alleged violation of the protesters' First and Fourth Amendment rights, including the rights of peaceful assembly, petition for redress of grievances, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and freedom from unreasonable seizures. And then, next section is qualified immunity excuses police abuse. When the plaintiffs litigate these lawsuits, they will be met with a qualified immunity defense. It shields officers from liability unless, one, they violated the Fourth Amendment by using excessive force, and two, they should have known they were violating, quote, clearly established, unquote, law. Even in the most egregious cases, it's often difficult to prove the second prong if there is no prior case finding similar police conduct illegal. That's ridiculous. They all swear oaths to the Constitution. In the case of federal officers, they swear oaths to the Constitution. They've got to know they're violating clearly established law. On June 15th, the Supreme Court declined to review 8 cases that would have given them the opportunity to reconsider the qualified immunity defense. Emma Anderson and the ACLU were handling one of those cases, quote, requiring government actors to be careful before treading on someone's constitutional rights is the only reasonable approach if you truly value those rights and want to ensure they thrive rather than wither over time, unquote. Anderson, a senior staff attorney at the ACLU, told CBS News, quote again, as qualified immunity has become an increasingly high bar, it has become tougher for victims of government misconduct to vindicate their rights in court, unquote. That's, by the way, the basis of the police state. Indeed, as the Supreme Court noted in 1986, quote, qualified immunity provides ample protection to all but the plainly incompetent or those who knowingly violate the law, unquote. Since the Black Lives Matter uprisings began, qualified immunity has become a hot button issue. Colorado made history on June 19th by banning the qualified immunity defense. Congress is considering proposals that could abolish or water down the defense. Representatives Justin Amash, the Democrat of Michigan, Ayanna Pressley, Democrat of Massachusetts. Since when is Justin Amash a Democrat? He's a he's a libertarian Republican, if I recall correctly. I don't know if he may have been kicked out of the Republican Party by now, but I'm sure he didn't become a Democrat. Pretty sure anyway. I'll double check that and see, but I think that's a mistake. And Ayanna Pressley introduced the Ending Qualified Immunity Act in the House of Representatives on June 4th. It provides there will be no qualified immunity defense if an officer claimed he or she was acting in good faith or reasonably believed that his or her conduct was lawful at the time it was committed. It also specifies there is no defense even if the law was not clearly established at the time of the officer's conduct. Senators Ed Markey, Bernie Sanders, and Elizabeth Warren introduced the Senate's companion bill on July 1st. If we want to change the culture of police violence against Black and brown Americans, Markey said, they need to start holding accountable the officers who abuse their positions of trust and responsibility in our community. And that means once and for all abolishing the dangerous judicial doctrine known as qualified immunity. Yes, abolish it. At a time, this is a quote, when unprecedented numbers of people demanding an end to police murder, brutality, and impunity, we've got to finally abolish qualified immunity, Sanders declared. And quote again, this is not a radical idea. Police officers must be held fully accountable for abuses they commit. No one is above the law. If we are serious about real police reform, the Senate has got to pass our Ending Qualified Immunity Act. I'll tell you, without strong demonstrations for days on end in front of the Senate, there is no way Mitch McConnell is going to pass that act. Now, of course, we can always see to it that Mitch McConnell does not win his Senate seat again, that he's gone, or we can see to it, okay, that Democrats get a majority in the Senate, and so it's not a question, okay, of Mitch McConnell actually blocking it. Of course, there's no guarantee the Democrats would pass it too, but at least there are Democrats who are advocating for it, and we could put more pressure on Democratic senators to pass that. And, quote, for too long, Warren stated qualified immunity has shielded police officers who have engaged in unconstitutional and appalling conduct from being held accountable in court. It's past time to end this doctrine. God bless you, honey. I'm proud to join my colleagues in co-sponsoring this bill and putting forward reforms to help end the systemic racism that plagues policing in America. There's more on how the Republicans are unlikely to agree with reform and have a bill of their own moderating the amount of reform, okay, originally. But as Cohn says, it falls to the people to demand its abolition. Oh, that is to say, the abolition of the qualified immunity defense. So, there's also an article on The Markey Bill, backed by Sanders and Warren, by John Kelly in Common Dreams. And you might want to take a look at that article as well. Oh, that has a picture of that has a picture of the police officer in Buffalo walking by the motionless body of 75-year-old. The other guy's name is Martin Gugino, as he bleeds from his ear after being attacked by officers during a protest on June 5th, 2020. I'm sure we all remember that one. So that tells you about the Senate Act, itself. And it gives you the provision of the act. And various tweets. So I recommend that article too, but I won't go through it. I still have a couple of pieces that I want to cover before I summarize this. So a couple of things I want to cover. They're not really two pieces. The first is an article what happened to the article? I got to get it up here. Is by David Sirota from his Substack blog. Let me get up to that. Let me find that again. I scrolled down too far. Let me set of links here. Here we go. And the title of the article is "They Had the Medicare for All money all along." And of course, that leans heavily on the kinds of things that MMT economists, and Stephanie Kelton say. And it's a nicely put piece by David Sirota, who, as you know, was writing speeches for Bernie Sanders when Bernie was giving speeches during this campaign, but also held back by Bernie Sanders because David Sirota is too much of a fire breather for Bernie. Anyway, Dave says, in recent weeks, we've seen healthcare industry CEOs report paying themselves $2.4 billion as 27 million people were thrown off their healthcare coverage. You've also seen Americans being charged anywhere from $400,000 to $1.1 million for COVID treatment and facing $2,000 bills for coronavirus tests. Remember, those tests were supposed to be free, right? Didn't Trump say to everybody those tests are free? No, there was a trucker from Canada who had a video today, and he reported that he drove a truck down to Texas and was involved in an accident, and he had to go to the emergency room, and while he was there, or at least to a health facility, to a hospital, and while he was there, 5 people came in wanting COVID-19 tests and had symptoms, and the 5 people were told they could not get their tests unless they would pay $200 for them. the five people didn't have $200, so they all walked out. And of course, that's the kind of thing that's responsible for the uptick in the spread of cases that we're seeing in America. And this trucker was advising Doug Ford and the Prime Minister, of Canada, Justin Trudeau, not to open up the borders with the United States. In other words, to keep them closed, because the United States is botching up COVID testing and care and not supplying the care free to people so that they can get there, so that the control of the virus can be reached here in the United States. So the trucker was saying it's dangerous to have Americans coming up to Canada. It's dangerous. And he doesn't want the border to be fully opened. He said this, of course, after he got back to Canada. But but you're getting the point. Anyway, Americans being charged anywhere from $400,000 to $1.1 million for COVID treatment and facing $2,000 bills for coronavirus tests. In response, polls show Americans deeply concerned about the current healthcare system and support for Medicare for All. They surged. Yes, it's now among the Democratic voters, as we'll shortly see, it's 88%. And yet, despite data showing a single-payer system would save big money, surveys still indicate some popular trepidation about the price tag of government-sponsored health care. This reflects in part a Democratic primary season that saw most candidates, the press corps, and the Washington political class try to pretend the planet's wealthiest nation can't possibly afford the kind of Medicare for All system that other less wealthy nations have had for decades. Quote, no matter how you cut the numbers, there's absolutely no way to pay for Medicare for All without tax increases or spending cuts on the middle class, unquote. One pro-austerity group said to Politico in a story breathlessly touted by the healthcare industry's dark money group. I'm reading from Dave's piece. That is Dave Sirota, not David Dayen now. I guess the Davids are very active. Okay, the name of this blog, by the way, is Too Much Information. Oh, God. Sorry, I lost it for a moment. I've lost it for more than a moment, but I will get it back. Here's what a few seem to have noticed as of the last few months. But here's what few seem to have noticed. As of the last few months, we just definitively proved we actually did have the money all along. And we had it even if we never hiked taxes to raise new revenues. Somehow this astounding fact was never granted any of the same giant bold-faced headlines that all the anti-Medicare for All fear-mongering generated during the presidential primary. Under our current system, America is on track to spend roughly $52 trillion on health care in the next decade. That includes both government programs, for example, Medicare, Medicaid, etc., and household spending, insurance premiums, out-of-pocket costs, etc. Medicare for All would consolidate all that spending under one program. Experts estimate this would require the government to come up with an additional $20 trillion and $36 trillion money that would cover the out-of-pocket spending that households and employers would otherwise pay to insurance companies, drug companies, and other parts of the corporate-run healthcare system. Well, guess what? Says David. That happens to be almost exactly the same amount of money our government committed to corporate bailouts since 2008. After the 2008 financial crisis, lawmakers gave $700 billion of grants to big banks. Depending on how you count, the Federal Reserve additionally committed somewhere between 16 trillion and 29 trillion to large financial institutions. By the way, that $29 trillion estimate is from a study that was done at the Levy Institute by a PhD candidate. Christ. Sorry, I can't make the scrolling work right now. My scroller. Here we go. Well, maybe here we're not going. I have no idea why this is happening, but I'm sure it will clear up in a moment. Let me maybe my Windows scroll function will come back if I refresh the page. So if you can wait for a moment. Okay, so anyway, Dave goes on. What I was about to say about the $29 trillion is that figure is from a study by a graduate student, okay, of Randy Ray's. He was a graduate student in the UMKC economics program, okay, when Randy was there. But the funding came from the Levy Institute, and the study was done for the Levy Institute, and it showed that some $29 trillion worth of credit was extended to financial institutions and banks following the crisis of 2008. What I want you to know, though, is that that study was completed in 2011. And the aid to the banks and financial institutions, okay, the large ones, hadn't stopped by the time the study was published in 2011. It was continuing. There has been no successor study since then. We do not know how many trillions in aid were extended beyond the 29 trillion. We do not know if another 29 trillion was extended before the program was ended. That may well have been the case. But David Sirota doesn't point out the possibility of this. But he then points out that a decade later, amid the coronavirus outbreak, lawmakers passed a bailout bill that will funnel $4 trillion to large corporations. He's talking about, I think, the $4.6 trillion slush fund over at the Federal Reserve for large corporations to take advantage of. But anyway, going on with what Dave says. So again, the same government that says we cannot afford 20 to 35 trillion over a decade to finance a Medicare for All program just gave corporate America between 20 trillion and 35 trillion since the financial crisis roughly a decade ago. And that money was funneled to corporate America, not just in the absence of tax increases. It was delivered while the government was actually cutting taxes. So the point being, what actually happened is that the government just gave corporate America more than between 20 and 35 trillion. It might have given corporate America as much as 50 to 60 trillion since the financial crisis roughly a decade ago. It may have been as high as that. We do not know. But Dave is right. It was delivered while the government was actually cutting taxes. The picture gets even more absurd when you slightly broaden the frame and add in another 10 trillion that we nonchalantly spent on other items. For instance, we spent $2 trillion on the Iraq War. We also spent a combined $2.6 trillion on increases in the Pentagon's already giant base budget since its first post 9/11 budget, and we devoted about $5 trillion to the Bush and Trump tax cuts. And then, of course, he makes the point, which we all agree on: deficit concerns are only raised when spending might actually help human beings. And he goes on to make that central MMT point and central point, okay, the Democratic Socialists, okay, as well. And he says, by contrast, the same reporters, think tankers, and lawmakers who spent the primary season attacking Medicare for all and preening as spendthrifts never bothered to ask about pay-fors for all the aforementioned money for Wall Street firms, defense contractors, and high-income tax cuts. All that happened without attendant deficit-neutral tax increases to finance it. We somehow just found the money. The discrepancy spotlights an unstated truth. Our political class only worries about deficits and so-called fiscal responsibility when spending might actually help ordinary people. If it's a plan to reduce student debt, to help retirees or expand healthcare, you can bet all of Washington is going to be ranting and raving about deficit concerns. And yet when a proposal enriches the large corporations that buy elections and own our democracy and own our political system, I would not say democracy, because obviously if they own it, it ain't a democracy, it's an oligarchy. We can always find the money and divert it away from initiatives like Medicare for All that might actually help the millions of ordinary people. So Dave makes that argument in a good way. It's not an original argument. It's being made frequently by all of us. Didn't hurt, though, to make it again. Okay, he put it in a good way. And I'm happy to see the post. But what it underlines, okay, is that we have a failure. We have a failure in passing policies that are favored by the people. All we can pass, it seems, are policies favored by the oligarchy. And I want to underline that point myself with a tweet of mine that occurred a couple of days ago. Let me share that. Here we are sharing my screen. Let me share my tweet here. So, the Ryan Knight at Proud Socialist had tweeted, 88% of Democrats support the Medicare for All. 85% support a wealth tax. 85% support a Green New Deal. And 75% support student debt cancellation. So no, the activists calling on Joe Biden to embrace these policies are not dividing the Democratic Party. His period, corporate period, donors period, our period. And I replied by asking what I thought was a very commonsensical question. How long can Speaker Pelosi, Senator Schumer, Joe Biden, who oppose hashtag MFA, hashtag a wealth tax, hashtag GND, and hashtag student debt cancellation, continue to lead a political party where support for each of these ranges from 88% to 75%. And then I say, all should announce their commitment to these positions or retire now. if we can't have leaders of the Democratic Party who are unresponsive to levels of support for particular policies, going from 88% to 75%, and not be responsive to a single one of these policies, these so-called leaders, the presumptive nominee for the presidency of the United States, the Democratic Party, the minority leader of the Senate, who hopes to be the majority leader, and the Speaker of the House for the Democrats. If these so-called leaders of the Democratic Party can't manage to be responsive to voters who support particular policies to the tune of 88% to 75%, then clearly the party is an oligarchy. Clearly, it is unresponsive to its base. And clearly, those leaders, if they believe in democracy at all, should commit to these positions or retire immediately. And if they don't do so, the 88 to 75% who support all these policies should immediately desert that party and move to a third party with ballot access who would appreciate and who would support their policy preferences. And the Democratic Party is an oligarchy, and it must be broken in order to break the larger oligarchy that is stopping the policies that people want from actually passing. So, in sum, when it comes to the various issue areas we have reviewed here, COVID-19, the economy, the performance of our federal government, the maintenance of our civil liberties and rights, the passage of policies popular with most of us, including Medicare for all, and the issue of oligarchy supplanting democracy. It is clearly the case that in all those issues, with respect to all those issues, that the United States is a failure. Right now, we are failing in all these dimensions. We are doing far worse than other democracies that in the past have looked up to us. To them, we are a bad joke right now. And we are also a failure compared to them when it comes to how we've been handling the COVID-19 crisis, how we've been handling our social movements, how we've been running the United States. These people, Republican and Democrat alike, these people must go. They are not proper leaders for a democracy. Our democracy hangs in the balance, and we will get it back only if we replace these leaders. Okay, your comments. Steve says, watch the Convo Couch show on this. Fiorella and Pasta are both in tears. Yes, I was close to in tears myself. Steve says, defund the police. School police don't need tanks and grenade launchers. No police need tanks and grenade launchers. Kay says, status quo did a few live reports from Louisville today. Yes, I know they did. Sandy says, maybe they need to take classes in physics. Steve says, status quo are the best on the ground. Yeah, they're the best on the ground because generally speaking, anyway, they're the only ones on the ground. Kay says, yes, they're very good. Yeah, they're the only ones who talk to people. The mainstream press don't talk to people, except maybe for Ali Velshi sometimes. Sandy Six says, hi, Joanne. Hi, Joanne. Steve says, the British were getting ready to outlaw slavery in the colonies. Independence Day is a lie. Farce of you lie. Yes, the British were getting ready, and Independence Day has certain dishonest aspects about it, but nevertheless, certain ideals are attached to it. Those ideals are legitimate, and they are the ideals we need to call up now to support our own efforts. Steve says Georgia has issued a state of emergency. Steve Gonzo. When did they issue a state of emergency, Steve? But today, I hadn't heard that, but that's really interesting. Sandy says those kips, rubber bullets, can have a metal core. Steve says, Steve Wolfbrand says, fucking pigs, fucking pigs, fucking pigs. Sandy says, I saw that. Steve says, again, Georgia issued a state of emergency. Evelina says, what's going on? The tear gas killed a woman with asthma. Oh, my God. Kay says, yes, that happened here in Ohio. Steve says, tear gas is chemical warfare. It is, Steve. It is chemical warfare. It's outlawed internationally. I can't see why the courts don't declare it unconstitutional here. It's a violation of human rights, a violation of international treaties we have signed. We cannot use tear gas during war, according to the treaties we have signed. It's been outlawed, but we can use it on our own populations? That's absurd. It's ridiculous. Steve Gonzo says, quote, peaceful protests were hijacked by criminals with a dangerous, destructive agenda. Now, innocent Georgians are being targeted, shot, and left for dead, unquote, said Governor Kemp. This lawlessness must be stopped and order restored in our capital city. I have declared a state of emergency and called up the Georgia Guard because the safety of our citizens comes first. This measure will allow troops to protect state property and dispatch state law enforcement officials to patrol our streets. Enough. In other words, that governor is a fascist. He's a fascist, an absolute and utter fascist. He's trying to reimpose the fascist state in Georgia, which was historically fascist. Kay says, happened in Columbus, Ohio, a so-called blue spot, SMH. I like this judge. What is his whole name? From L.A., Soul's name, I think his name was R. Brooke Jackson, wasn't it? Let me get the thing again. I'm looking for it. I think it was R. Brooke Jackson is the name of the judge, but I'm going to. Yes, Judge R. Brooke Jackson. Maybe his first name is actually Rupert. That sticks in my mind somewhere. But anyway, it's Brooke, Brooke. Evelina Pont says, extremely distressing. And Steve says, yes, the pigs here in LA are terrible. Joanne says, anyone else on the edge due to the chaos and ignorance in our country? Steve Wolfbrand said, are you kidding me? Kay says, yes, Joanne, I think we all are. The LA sheriffs are worse for LAPD. Evelina says, this criminal element from Georgia, okay, or from another state. I haven't been in LA too many times. I think only twice. Only, okay, on 2 occasions. Kay says, I thought Justin Amash went independent. Yes, I thought he did too, Kay. Okay, and Lana says, how long has qualified immunity been on the books? I believe since the 1980s, since 1983 or something like that. It was tested in the courts and they upheld it. It's actually a judicial doctrine. I think it's failed. Why Georgia? Because Brian Kemp is having a total failure with respect to COVID, and he's trying to, get emergency powers so he can protect his butt, and he's using the ideology of Donald Trump, okay, to do it. Steve says, the qualified immunity to kill people, indeed. Joanne says, vote for MMT progressives for Congress and Senate, and donate to them, too. And Deborah Wilson says, fuck Warren. Steve says, odds are it's cops and boogie boy types. Steve says, since slavery. Mona says, I am not sure. I think it dates from the 1980s, not from slavery. Evelina says, should the FBI be investigating? Trump's FBI? I think the FBI should be investigating, certainly, but Trump's FBI? Attorney General Barr's FBI? Steve Gunza says, I don't seem to be able to directly reply again, so I'm just throwing it out there. Laugh out loud. Evelina says, sorry. Joanne says, Steve Wolfbrandt, I need Xanax. Steve says, apparently Charlie Daniels was quite the racist. Who knew? And Kate Clark Ron says, Joanne, no you don't. That shit is not good at all. Joanne says, no, there's a serious warning on that drug. Yes, I know. Serious warning. Kay says, I found out about Charlie when I moved to Wilmington, North Carolina, his hometown, Steve. Rick Maynard says, evening all. Hi, Rick. And Joanne says hi. And Joyce Ann says, I recommend going back and listening to James Baldwin. I recommend reading Chris Hedges. I recommend realizing how Congress writes the legislative corporation, not the people. Ralph Nader was the last one to help to get some legislation through for the people, and that happened for the last time when Nixon was in office. Yes, you might have to go back that far to find some legislation, big legislation, that was really for the people. Sandy Degg says, hi, Richard. Joyce Ann says, private for-profit insurance is killing Americans monetarily and literally. Yes, Joyce Ann, that's been going on for a very, very long time. In fact, I did a little study of my own indicating that during the Obama administration, between 2010 and 2016, there were 356,000 fatalities due to lack of insurance. That was the cost of Obama's passing the Affordable Care Act instead of H.R. 676. Sandy says, hi, Stephanie. And Joanne says, Joyce Ann, I worked for BX. Stephanie says, hey, everyone, sorry, I just woke up and went to emergency. YIP. And Kay says, for profit, sick care makes more money keeping you sick. Stephanie says, but I'm here about to share to my largest groups. Thank you, Stephanie. Kay says, hope you're getting better, Steph. Yes, I hope so too, Steph. Steve Day says, the money is under Pelosi's seat. It's probably in her refrigerator, her designer refrigerator in back of all the ice cream. Sandy says, hi, Matthew. Joanne says, TV, I'm... Sandy says, not in the freezer next to her ice cream? Steve says, fucking Bernie, he could have brought up MMT, just move the fucking decimal point. That's what the government just did. He could have brought MMT. He could have taught a little bit of MMT. It isn't really that hard. If he had started with his first speech of the campaign with some of the basic points and then made those same points in every speech during his campaign, he would have had the whole country cheering for MMT. But he was too chicken to try. Stephanie could have given him a speech in a New York second. Joanne says, TV commercials for pharma also added risk and cost. And if he had done that, he could not have been harassed throughout his whole campaign by the damned media asking him, how are you going to pay for it? How are you going to pay for it? How are you going to pay for it? He just should have said, I'll give you 3 letters, fellas and girls. OCF. Overt congressional financing. And or $1 trillion coins. Joanne says, Steve Wolfbrand, and should have instead of calling it Dem Socialism. Steve Dungso said, I MMT trolled the crap out of BS, out of Bernie Sanders and Sirota, to no avail. Well, probably to no avail because they knew all about MMT. It's obvious that Sirota has talked to Stephanie many times, and we know Bernie has, and we know they've gotten the spiel. They just couldn't say anything about it in the campaign because Bernie vetoed it. Sirota would have said something about it if Bernie hadn't vetoed it. Steve says Epstein didn't kill himself. Joanne says, oh no, lost connection. Lana says, what I am trying to figure out is at what point are enough of us going to be ready to demand Medicare for all? I don't know, but we got to get into the streets. We got to get into the streets for that too. Seth Rich sent the thumb drive to WikiLeaks. Steady says, hey, my loves, I made it finally. Laugh out loud. I slept all day. FR. Stephanie says, in the emergency room. Steve Wolfbrand says, debates and rallies. And Lana says, I like Ryan Knight. Yes. And Steve Gonzo said, Giselle has the P-tape. Reportedly has a secret insurance a video stash, says Steve Gonzo. Steve Wolfbrand says, you okay? And Joanne says, hope they can fix your kidney issues. Deborah says, how long can those pigs deny us? Evelina says, I think he planned to talk about MMT when he had the time to expand on it. The missed opportunity, you think? Slogans are reductionist, don't adequately define. When he started with the campaign, with the first speech, he needed to bring up the issue of how things would be funded. And he needed to explain in 2 paragraphs why that is never an issue. You can explain it very shortly, and then you can repeat and repeat and repeat. You don't even have to mention MMT by name. If you want to see a very short explanation, go to my blog site, to josephmfirestone.com, and look at the 3rd blog down on how you're going to pay for it. Okay, I actually wrote it to help people in the 2018 campaign. It's like 700 words. 700 words. Not too much for Bernie to use in a campaign. Steve says, well, I'll have an extra kidney if we matched. Sorry. I lost. Deborah says, how long can those pigs deny us? Evelina says, I think he planned to talk about MMT. We had time to expand on it. Missed opportunity. Yeah, I think it was a missed opportunity. I think he blew the whole thing twice in the 2016 campaign and then again in the 2020 campaign. I'll tell you something else. He lost in 2016 anyway. If he had started teaching MMT in 2016, by 2020, it would have been an old story. And they wouldn't have been asking him how you're going to pay for it in 2020. Yeah, he blew it then in 2016. Evelina says, what the hell it is about to a very diverse audience. You don't have to explain the whole thing. Just how they're going to pay for it. Hammer that home over a period of time. Even the majority of GOP voters want the Medicare for all now. Yes, it's true. More than 50% do want Medicare for all. And 75% of the independent voters want it too. Evelina says, diverse and brainwashed. Once campaign was suspended due to COVID, opportunity to make a presentation was gone. That was exactly the time to make the presentation. He had nothing to lose. He had nothing to lose. He suspended his campaign. He was completely free to talk about anything he wanted to talk about. The first thing he could have talked about was a campaign over Facebook complaining about all the people who asked him how he was going to pay for it and explaining to them why that was just bullshit. He could have had hours about that. With a parade of MMTers on backing him up. Deborah Wilson says, I love your optimism. My optimism? I don't know if I'm optimistic. I just want to fight. Matt says, are we living at the end of the American empire? I hope so. I don't want an American empire. I hope we're living at the end of it. I hope it ends fast. It's an albatross around our necks. We get nothing from the American empire, only grief. Steve Day says hashtags are great. Post that, include hashtag, get collected where you are clicking on it. Builds a library stack on the subject, helps posts go viral. The more hashtags posted. Stephanie says, thank you guys for asking. I appreciate you for asking, MP. They gave me antibiotics, but nothing for pain. Thank you, though, for the offer, precious. Yeah. Kay says, Ali Velshi is one of the few I actually watch, okay, on MSDNC anymore. Yeah, because Ali Velshi, I think, is fairly honest. He's certainly honest when it comes to Medicare for all. Probably because he's a Canadian. And he's just not going to lie about what's going on in Canada. Lana says, getting ready too, but when did the British actually stop their own slavery? To my knowledge, they didn't completely get rid of it until Queen Victoria's reigns in all their provinces. I thought it was, wasn't it, when they came out and stopped the slave trade sometime in the 1820s or 1830s? Seems to me something like that. To my knowledge, they didn't completely get rid of it until the Queen Victoria's reign in all their provinces. Yeah, I think that's probably right, Lana. And Stephanie says, Steve Wolfbrandt, I'm okay, just in lots of pain. Well, that's not so okay, Steph. Try to meditate. It helps for pain. Steve Wolfbrandt says, long before we did. And Lana says, Brooke Jackson, thanks. And Steve Wolfbrandt, it doesn't apply to the revolution. Sorry. Stephanie says, I wish I could have seen the whole live stream with you all. The 1970s and 1980s sucked in several ways. Yes, they did. We turned bad in the 1970s, okay, and 1980s. We didn't stick with the progress we were making during the 1960s. There was a reaction when we elected Richard Nixon. Okay, there was a reaction. Hubert Humphrey would have been far better. As president, he would have been far, far better. Steve Wolfbrandt says, disco sucked. Steve Wolfbrandt, I liked it, but I like most music. Steve says, Michelle Obama is okay, let's not. Rick says, night all. Kay says, my Scott died in January 2016. I'm so sorry, Kay. And Stephanie says, I'm so sorry I missed the SG. The SG? And Deborah says, why Bernie? I'm sorry, why Bernie about what? And Steve says, sorry, Kay. Steve Day says, overt congressional financing. Steve says, some disco wasn't bad. Steph says, I love the people in this group. I feel like I belong. I've never felt that in Real Progressives or Progressive Independent Party. Says, but you folks are awesome. Thank you, Stephanie. We really appreciate that. We think you're awesome, too. Kay says, I feel the same, Steph. Steph says, my comments are not complete. I accidentally send it before I'm finished. Okay. And Steph says, my comments. Kay says, Bernie should have had Kelton at some of his rallies. He should have had her at his rallies. He should have had her as one of his campaign co-chairs. She would have been great as one of his campaign co-chairs. When he was in the Senate, she could have represented him well. In Iowa, Steve Wolfbrandt says, I do that all the time. Sandy says, we should send that blog to Howie Hawkins. Well, we have to send to Howie Hawkins 3 blogs. The third from the top, which is the short version of OCF. The second from the top, which is the answer to the inflation objections. And the top, which is the argument that it conflicts with pay-go, and that's a good thing. We need to get rid of pay-go. Stephanie says, I feel comfortable saying what I wanted to without being judged. We don't really judge people here. That's not, we all say our piece, but we don't really judge people. It's on the views, it's on the issues. We don't usually say nasty things to people. It's very rare. Kay says, me too, Steph. So glad I found you all. Steve says, they just pulled $4 trillion out of their ass. Hey, Bernie, how are you going to pay for that? We should all bombard the Bernie campaign with our pleas for him to espouse MMT. He should espouse it, but never mention the letters on MMT. Stephanie said, I wasn't old enough, but I remember my mom used to listen to disco. I wasn't a big fan of it myself. I worked with a friend back then that used to drag me to the local disco bar here in town. Stephanie says, thank you for the show tonight, Dr. Joe. Well, thank you for coming, Stephanie. Evelyn asks, were you a good dancer? Steve says, I have an extra kidney if anyone needs one. That is a handsome offer, Steve. It really is. Kay says, yes, I was pretty good. I danced in the cage at local dances back then. Evelina says, you broke? But laugh out loud. Okay, guys, I guess it's time for me to say goodnight. This was a fun stream. Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for sharing. And thank you all for being good to each other. That's really important, especially these days. We've got to all be together. Oh, by the way, we should start visiting Corona Strike again, because that's a website where general strikes might emerge. I'm thinking we might need a general strike real soon now. Good night. Good night.